Shalom from Israel. I am Hananya Naftali with the latest update from the Middle East. Eli Sharabi, former hostage, stood before the United Nations and shattered every lie the world has been telling about Hamas, Gaza, and this war. And yet, most of the media will ignore it. Why? Because his words prove that Hamas is not the only problem. Gaza's civilians are not innocent bystanders. Let's talk about it.
My name is Eli Sharabi. I am 53 years old. I've come back from hell. I've returned to tell my story. On October 7, my heaven turned to hell. Sirens began. Hamas terrorists invaded, and I was ripped away from my family, never to see them again.
For 491 days, Eli was chained in Hamas tunnels, starved, beaten, humiliated. But his suffering didn't begin in captivity. It started the moment he was dragged into Gaza, where a mob of Palestinian civilians tried to lynch him. These weren't Hamas militants. These were regular people, the same ones the world cries over every day, pretending they are victims.
The civilians in Gaza saw us suffering. They cheered our kidnappers. They were definitely involved.
This isn't just about Eli Sharabi. This is about the biggest lie the world tells itself, that Hamas is some separate entity from the Palestinian people. It's not. Hamas exists because it is supported, protected, and celebrated by the people of Gaza. I mean, sure, they do have opposition, but the truth is that the Palestinians in Gaza celebrated them. And today, we're going to break this down. No sugarcoating, no political correctness, just the hard truth. And maybe that's why Hamas doesn't want you to see this video. Let's be clear, Hamas is not some rogue force controlling Gaza against the will of the people. It thrives because a significant portion of the population supports it. Hamas is embedded in Gaza society, both politically, militarily, and ideologically. If you think that sounds harsh, let's talk about what happened on October 7th. When over 1,200 Israelis were butchered, victims were raped, others burnt alive. And what did the people of Gaza do? Did they stand up and say this is wrong? Did they condemn Hamas? No. They danced in the streets, they handed out candy, they filmed themselves celebrating genocide. Eli Sharabi witnessed it firsthand. As he was dragged from his peaceful home across the border into Gaza, he saw hundreds of people laughing, celebrating, and filming themselves. Not Hamas terrorists, civilians.
I saw over 100 terrorists filming themselves, celebrating, laughing, partying in our gardens as they massacred my friends and neighbors. They dragged me out, they dragged me to the border, beating me the whole way. My face was swollen, my ribs bruised. When we arrived in Gaza, a mob of civilians trying to lynch me. They pulled me from the car, but the terrorists rushed me away into a mosque. I was their trophy.
And when he got there to Gaza, they tried to tear him apart. Civilians tried to rip him apart. And yet, every single day, we are bombarded with sob stories about poor civilians in Gaza. The international community cries about collective punishment as if these people had no role in the violence. Hamas didn't drop out of the sky on the people of Gaza. It's a made-in-Gaza product. The Hamas members are not Chinese. They are Palestinians from Gaza. And it is funded, housed, and protected by the very people the world calls victims. You think the pro-Palestine protests around the world care about Eli and the other hostages held in Hamas tunnels? Because I know they don't. In their twisted logic, Eli is the occupier. in their minds, he didn't get kidnapped. He was some settler who invaded Gaza to steal land, and taking him as hostage was resistance. That's how they would probably justify this insanity. They don't see Hamas as the aggressor. They see Israel as the terrorist state and Hamas as some freedom fighters. These are the same people, by the way, marching in Western capitals, screaming from the river to the sea, demanding that Israel stop the war, but they don't want peace. They don't care about hostages. I'll tell you what, they don't even care about Palestinians. They don't care. They care about only one thing, and it's erasing Israel. One of the most damning parts of Eli's speech was his testimony about humanitarian aid. Because guess what? All that aid the world keeps demanding Israel send to Gaza, Hamas steals it. And the hostages, they never saw it. Any of it.
We had to beg for food, beg to use the bathroom. Begging was our existence.
Eli watched Hamas terrorists take dozens of boxes labeled with UN and UNRWA logos and drag them into tunnels, while he and the other hostages were starving. Hamas fighters eat like kings. They have meat, rice, sugar, bread, medicine. They smoke, they drink tea. They eat the aid that is meant for starving civilians.
I was held captive in the darkness, isolated from the world by Hamas terrorists. They took pleasure in our suffering. Living as a hostage, you don't know how the day will begin, nor how it will end, whether you live or die. At any moment, they could beat you. At any moment, they could kill you.
And yet, every single time Israel inspects an aid truck, the world screams about humanitarian disasters. The UN, the Red Cross, and every so-called human rights organization knows exactly what's happening. They know Hamas is hoarding supplies and stealing humanitarian aid. And they also know that Israel had facilitated over 1 million tons of aid into the Gaza Strip. But instead of admitting the truth that Israel is not the problem, they just blame Israel. This is the game. The world demands Israel send aid, so Israel sends aid. Then Hamas steals it, and the world blames Israel for starving Gaza. It's a scam that feeds terrorists while making Israel the villain. And the worst part? The UN, UNRWA, and even the Red Cross are complicit in it. Eli Sharabi asked one simple question at the UN that I hope every UN diplomat and leader listened to. Eli asked, where was the world while we were being tortured underground? For 491 days, Hamas held hostages in unimaginable conditions. No daylight, no food, no medical treatment. People with open wounds were left without medical treatment. People were beaten for speaking. They were forced to beg for food like animals. And where was the Red Cross? Nowhere. Where was the UN? Too busy to blame Israel for defending itself.
I'm here before you now to give my testimony and to ask, where was the United Nations? Where was the Red Cross? Where was the world? I know that you discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it.
And then when it came time to release hostages, Hamas made them walk through crowds of Palestinian civilians who spit on them, who screamed at them, who cheered for their kidnappers. These are the people the UN wants us to make peace with? The ones who spit on victims and worship their captors? Eli Sharabi stood before the United Nations and exposed every last one of them. He told them, in plain words, you cannot claim to stand for humanity while ignoring those still in hell. And what did the UN do? Nothing. They just sat there nodding their heads. Some were busy on their phones and then went back to their usual script. We need a two-state solution. Israel must stop the war. Gaza needs more aid. They hear the truth. They ignore it because it doesn't fit their agenda. Plain and simple. But I have to tell you, here's the bottom line. You cannot be neutral between good and evil. The former hostage, Eli Sharabi, that just spoke at the UN, is living proof that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel. Hamas uses hospitals, schools, and mosques as terror bases. And the media still prefers to pretend that they care about civilians. Israel warns civilians before strikes. Hamas uses civilians as human shields. Israel fights to bring hostages home. Hamas fights to keep hostages underground. Yet in the eyes of the world, both sides are the same. Enough of this fake morality. Enough of pretending that Hamas and its supporters deserve sympathy. The Bible tells us exactly how to deal with evil. Eradicate it. We're not going to apologize for saying this and for wanting to exist. The world loves to say there is no military solution to this conflict. This is a lie. Because the only way to achieve peace is for Israel to do exactly what it is doing. To destroy Hamas completely. Every hostage still in Gaza is living in a nightmare. Every second wasted on ceasefire talks that yield nothing because Hamas doesn't actually want to release hostages is another second of suffering for the hostages. Israel has one mission. Bring them home. Destroy Hamas. Never let this happen again. And I'm saying evil will not win. The truth will prevail. Israel will survive. And as for the UN, the Red Cross, the hypocritical world leaders that were silent, their silence will be remembered. So I'm telling you guys, if you stand with Israel, then please join the movement. Subscribe to my YouTube channel to never miss a piece of truth in a world of darkness and lies. So I ask you to share this video. And remember, the nation of Israel lives.